r/Nosleep. Posted by u/scratchminus. I recently started working as IT for a restaurant chain. The corporate office has some very strange rules. Part 1. Just a few weeks after graduating from college and moving back in with my folks, I landed my first full-time job. It wasn't anything crazy, just an IT position for a chain of restaurants. Something just grazing the floor of entry level while still offering enough to not be dismissed entirely. The work didn't seem bad and it was in my field, but it was easy enough to tell that this was a job plenty of non-IT people could do. If nothing else, I figured it would help me start saving money before I had to pay all my bills myself. The entire hiring process took less than a week. I received a text the day that I submitted my resume, asking me if I was available to interview the following day. Surprised by their response time, I agreed and met with them the next morning. The two people who interviewed me were nice enough. I answered their questions, asked my own, and was out in 15 minutes. And not a day later I received a text about them sending an offer letter. As much as I wanted to question the rushed hiring process, I let myself believe it was due to them needing a replacement for someone who quit. While that was somewhat true, I still wish I had considered it a bit more thoroughly. A few days passed and I was driving in for my first shift. I arrived at 7:30 a.m. despite the online scheduler saying I didn't start until 7:45 a.m. The parking lot was entirely deserted and the chains were still blocking all of the entrances. I figured now was as good a time as any to skim through the employee manual I had been emailed and printed out. Pulling the bundle of papers out of my bag, I barely glanced at a majority of them. Most of them were just basic procedures and information that you'd see at any job. I was barely registering what was on the pages until I passed a sheet with large bold font reading "Please read before first shift." These must be the real important rules, I thought. You know, the type of shit that could actually get you fired. Not wanting to screw up on my first day, I flipped the page and began reading. "Thank you for choosing to work with, redacted. While your job is very important to the functioning of our business, our first priority is your safety and well-being. Please read the following rules and follow them at all times. None of these are to be taken lightly, and breaking them will, in a best-case scenario, lead to your expulsion from the company. 1. If you are working the morning shift, the earliest you will ever be scheduled is 8 a.m. Should you notice that you are scheduled to open any earlier, this is a mistake. Do not enter the building until 8 a.m. or later. Likewise for the closing shift, you will never be scheduled past 10 p.m. 2. Closing procedures require that all employees lock up and exit the building by 10:21 p.m. at the latest. Do not stay past this time for any reason. The alarm will set automatically and you will not be able to leave. Should you get locked in, immediately go to the server room, lock the door, and stay there until 8 a.m. 3. If you are on a closing shift, ensure that all 3 entrances to the parking lot are properly chained off before leaving. Before locking the final chain, have your vehicle running with the door open and leave the premises immediately after it is latched. 4. Do not enter the door labeled private by the second floor restroom. There is equipment beyond it which is not only dangerous, but also cannot handle exposure to outside elements. Should you notice that this door is open, do not close it. Inform the CTO or a member of the custodial staff and they will handle it. 5. If an employee you do not recognize approaches and asks about fixing Tori's computer, politely respond "I'll put in a ticket for that" and leave immediately, maintaining eye contact until around a corner. If they approach you while in your cubicle, maintain eye contact after responding and call the CTO. He will direct you from there. 6. Differently from Rule 5, if someone calls asking about fixing Tori's computer, do not respond. Stay on the line silently and wait for them to hang up. Do not look away from your computer at this time, and ignore any urge to do so. 7. All calls between 7:06 p.m. and 8:17 p.m. should be ignored. No one needs your help. The restaurants know not to call during this time. 8. If you return to your cubicle to find a strangely tall man sitting at your desk and typing, leave the area as discreetly as possible and do not return for at least 30 minutes. There is an extra cubicle in the far corner of the accounting department which you can work at until then. 9. Should the man notice you and ask for assistance, stand a few feet away from the cubicle and calmly direct him on how to fix his issue until he dismisses you. It will usually be something as simple as reinstalling a browser he deleted. Do not instruct him incorrectly. Follow Rule 8 after being dismissed. 10. Do not run in the office unless you are sure you are in immediate danger. 11. If at any point you hear what sounds like running in the downstairs hall, close and lock the main IT department door immediately. As per Rule 10, no one should be running unless there is an emergency. 12. If something comes to the door, ignore it. Any employee needing access to a locked room will know the keypad lock code. Do not listen to anything claiming to be stuck outside. 13. A file titled New Department Procedures.mp4 will sometimes appear on your desktop. If this happens, close your eyes and open the file. You will hear sounds that seem to exit the computer and begin coming from all around you. Ignore them until they stop and wait 30 seconds after that to open your eyes. Your computer will have blue screened and will require a few reboots to start working again. If at any point you are confused by a rule or suspect you may have broken one, talk to the CTO or a member of the custodial staff. If anything seems strange or out of place, report it immediately. Following these rules will ensure that your time at Redacted is both a rewarding and learning experience. I stared at the paper, not quite sure what to think. Part of me thought it was just an elaborate prank that my boss wanted to play on the new kid. I looked at my car clock, which now reads 7:46. My car was still the only one on the street and no one had driven by since I'd arrived. They couldn't possibly have expected a new hire to open the building himself, so why was I the only employee here yet? After skimming over the rules a second time, my eyes focused on Rule 1. It seemed odd that they would make such a mistake on my very first day, especially after heavily emphasizing the fact that I would never work so early. I gazed across the street at the office building, its windows still dark and empty. My eyes were suddenly drawn to a window on the far end of the second floor where a set of blinds swung back and forth as if recently dropped. I decided to wait in the car until everyone else arrived, promptly at 8:01 a.m. It's been about 3 months since I first started. Somehow I've survived all this time without any major issues, but only thanks to the rules which I now carry with me at all times. By now I've had enough run-ins and genuine mistakes to scare me straight. For the most part everything has gone exactly as the rules stated, and following them has kept me out of harm's way. The closest call I've had was back in week 4 during my first solo closing shift. Spending the night in the server room was both physical and mental torture, the likes of which I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. Just imagine playing hide and seek with your friends and choosing to hide in the refrigerator. Except instead of being sought out by your friends, it's them. Despite the scare, I was strangely calm the next day. Maybe the trauma coming to a peaceful end made me realize that following the rules wasn't particularly difficult, and that was all that was needed to make it around here. It helped that my boss gave me a considerable raise after that night. I was almost beginning to believe nothing bad could happen as long as I stuck to the rules. I quickly realized that wasn't the case at all. About a week ago we got a new hire down in the accounting department. Today, he ruined everything. But we were still dealing with the aftermath of the problems caused by my careless co-worker. Oddly enough, my boss was impressed with the way I handled the situation, and that led to even more strange discoveries. But I'll get into those in another part. Another fact I want to clear up is how the rules work. As far as I can tell, every single rule applies to every single person here. Any employee could find the tall man at their desk, and any employee could receive the new Department Procedures.mp4 file on their desktop. No one has outright said this to me, but their demeanor makes it pretty apparent. Well, that and the story that I'm about to tell you basically proves it. So, the new guy. I'll call him Kevin. Kevin is the type of guy who always thinks he has the right answer. If he was at a scientific lecture about space, he would start telling the lecturer what space is actually like and how black holes work. And that's not to say he isn't a nice guy, but his way of handling things irked me from day one. So yesterday, pre-shit hitting the fan, I'm working at my cubicle as usual. I was the only IT member on shift at the time, but it had been a pretty slow morning with only 1 or 2 calls from the restaurants. Suddenly, I hear footsteps approaching the IT department, and a few seconds later Kevin strolls in. "Hey, I've got someone who needs help. They said Tori's computer is bugging out, so I said I'd go fetch IT." I froze. "We don't have a Tori here, Kevin." "No, we do," he said confidently. "If we didn't they wouldn't have asked that." "Kevin, there is no Tori in this office. What did you say to this person?" I could feel myself getting tense. In the back of my mind I could tell something dreadful was coming. He scoffed at me. "I said exactly what I just told you." From out in the hall I heard the slow shuffling approach of footsteps. They definitely weren't running, so I didn't know if now was a proper moment to bolt for the door and slam it shut. The last thing I wanted to do was completely derail from the rules. As the shuffling grew closer I turned back to Kevin. "Do not talk. I can handle this." I was talking entirely out of my ass. Every time I had run into this particular rule, I had responded with the proper "I'll put in a ticket for that" and removed myself from the situation. But now I was in uncharted territory. A man appeared in the doorway. He was dressed in casual business attire, much like the other employees at the office. His face was blank as he stared at me, maintaining vigorous eye contact which I returned in kind. I waited, hoping he might simply ask me about Tori's computer and I could just follow protocol from there. After being assaulted by his unblinking gaze for 30 seconds, I caved and began feeling around my desk for my work phone. I didn't dare break eye contact though. I ignored the shadows that danced on the edge of my vision, tempting me to glance at them, to look away. Kevin groaned as I picked up my phone. "Fine, if you're not going to help then I will. I'm sure I can fix whatever it is." I didn't respond. I'll admit that I was scared. After my first traumatic experience with breaking a rule I couldn't bring myself to even come close to breaking another. The shadows grew more vivid and lifelike. Fear edged into my brain. My only thought at the time was that looking away would be an irreversible mistake. I saw Kevin approach the man and motion towards the door. "Come on, let's get you taken care of." The man's eyes shifted to Kevin when he addressed him and instantly the figures faded from my peripheral vision. I blinked a couple times to clear my head from the rush and when I looked up the two were gone. God damn it. I bolted out of my chair and through the main IT department door, phone still in hand. I knew not to run, but keeping a co-worker from being dragged away to some unholy place with that man seemed like an emergency if I'd ever seen one. As I exited into the hallway my head whipped around wildly before I saw it. Down the hall, next to the second-floor restroom, the door labeled private was wide open. In my haste to find Kevin I hadn't been prepared to look away. Though I honestly doubt anything could have prepared me for what I saw. An unfathomably long corridor stretched out beyond the entrance, shrouded in darkness. The only light leaking in was from the windows along the left wall, whose blinds allowed the faintest trace of sun to peek through. The right wall had dozens upon dozens of doors which also followed the hallway into infinity. But what stood out the most was the dark mass standing motionless in the center of the hallway, maybe 100 feet away. Its vaguely humanoid shape was made up of a torso that was far too small for a person and extremely lanky legs and arms. Even though I could only make out its silhouette, the eyes of the creature gleamed in the darkness, deep and yellow. A glint of white flashed under its eyes as what I could only assume was its mouth cracked open into a wicked, toothy grin. In the back of my mind I knew I needed to call my CTO, but the instant I raised my phone up to dial the most horrific fucking shriek pierced the air. My head whipped up from the phone. But at the moment I glanced down the creature had taken an inhumanly large bound forward. I panicked, imagining what this beast would do if it were to escape, and I knew I needed to close the door first. But it was impossible. Even only having to cover half the distance the creature needed to reach the door, its speed severely outmatched mine. I turned tail and ran back to the IT department, slamming the door shut behind me. I could only hope that everyone else heard the frantic footsteps and banging of doors soon enough to shut themselves away as well. But when that thing began violently beating and clawing at the IT door, I realized that I was probably the only one with anything to worry about. Having fallen so far from the rules, I finally called my boss. He answered almost immediately and I told him everything that had happened. "Did you break eye contact with the man at any point?" he asked once I'd finished talking. "No, sir." "Good. You're fine, then. Don't worry about Kevin or the door, we'll sort it out." While I wasn't super fond of Kevin's attitude, I still didn't want anything bad to happen to him. "He's gonna be fired, isn't he?" My boss stayed silent for a few moments before responding. "Hopefully he can be." He told me to stay in the office with the door closed until further notice before hanging up. His words sank in as I sat listening to the banging on the door slowly fade into silence. The guilt of allowing Kevin to be taken weighed on me, even knowing that I most likely wouldn't have been able to stop him no matter how hard I tried. I was so caught up in my thoughts that I didn't even notice the slow shuffling of feet moving into the office. I looked up and saw Kevin, seeming practically unscathed if not a little ruffled. We stared at each other in silence and I almost started to tell him how glad I was that he'd made it back, but he cut me off. "Kevin needs help fixing his computer," he stated dully. His cadence was off, missing that confident air he always had about him. As he spoke he held perfect eye contact with me, not blinking a single time. My throat felt dry as I croaked out a response. "I'll put in a ticket for that." Kevin stared at me for a few more moments before nodding and shuffling backwards and out of sight. Against my better judgment, I stood and followed him out into the main IT room, where I found the door still firmly closed and locked while Kevin had vanished entirely. I went back to my desk and started to call my CTO, but was interrupted by the sound of 2 emails popping into my inbox. The first was from HR. Redacted, employees. A few changes have been made to the rules. Most of them are the same, but the following have been edited. 5. If any employee approaches and asks about fixing Tori or Kevin's computer, politely respond, "I'll put in a ticket for that," and leave immediately, maintaining eye contact until around a corner. If they approach you while in your cubicle and do not leave after you respond, maintain eye contact and call the CTO. He will direct you from there. 6. Differently from Rule 5, if someone calls asking about fixing Tori or Kevin's computer, do not respond. Stay on the line silently and wait for them to hang up. Do not look away from your computer at this time, and ignore any urge to do so. Additionally, the following rule has been added. 14. If at any point you see a pair of yellow eyes in the reflection of a mirror or window, look away immediately and avoid dark spaces for the next hour. If there is any confusion about these changes, please contact the CTO or custodial staff. The second email was from my boss. We'll begin sending you out to restaurants for troubleshooting next week. Before then, you'll receive an email containing some protocols to follow when at our stores. Please read them before your shift on Monday.